we come in peace. Star Trek Discovery premiered, and we come in peace is something you hear several times in the first episode. So what I'm going to be doing here is a review of Star Trek Discovery Episode 1, which is called Vulcan Hello. Of course, Star Trek Discovery has been very controversial. A lot of people are kind of upset about some of the designs. But remember, when Star Trek The Next Generation started, people were acting the same. They were really skeptical, and they're skeptical for pretty much the same reason. But I'm going into this with an open mind, and I'm prepared to be surprised. This series opens in 2256, which is 10 years before the original series, and this is in the prime timeline. So as things progress through the seasons, I would think that some things might start looking a bit more like the original Star Trek, but that remains to be seen if it continues after one season. But how does the first episode fare? Well, of course, we have Klingons, and the Klingons are the main enemy throughout most of Star Trek. But there is a very Star Trek feeling to this. I find it actually quite like the Star Trek original series movies, especially the lighting levels and things like that, but also the feeling. But there is a lot of talk about hope and peace, so that is very Star Trek-ish. In this episode, we are introduced to the crew of the USS Shenzhou, which is captained by Philippa Georgiou, acted by Michelle Yeoh. I was very excited when I heard that she was acting in this series. I thought this would be great. She's a main character? Well, actually, she's not. She is a guest. Of course, the captain of the Discovery is Jason Isaacs, but he doesn't appear in this episode. The main character of this series is Commander Michael Burnham, and she is acted by Sonequa Martin Green. Although she has a male name, she is a woman. And I find that her character is very interesting. Although she is raised on Vulcan by Vulcans, in particular Sarek, the father of Spock, she is very much a human. She is not Vulcan. So you should be very aware of that. The other main cast member is Lieutenant Saru. His actor is Doug Jones. He is a Kelpian. On his world, they were pretty much bred to be prey. And as a result, he is able to sense when death is coming. You know, that's something that prey do. When death is coming, they run. So his character is kind of a coward. I think that maybe we'll see some bravery come into his character in the future. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where his character goes. I like Captain Georgiou. She reminds me a lot of Picard. He has that diplomacy background. She does too, it seems. And she is very strong. She's a very strong character, so I like her a lot. As for Commander Burnham, she reminds me a bit of Spock and Data. Those are characters who were trying to find their identity, you know. They were trying to figure out their emotions. So that's a lot like what she is. But since this is the beginning of the series, you don't quite see the chemistry between the characters yet. I think that'll come in the future. But of course, we haven't met most of the cast yet. That'll come when Discovery is introduced. The Klingons, of course, are the most hotly debated topic in this. They don't look the same. Well, I shouldn't say that. They have the forehead ridges. They actually speak Klingon in this pretty much all the time, so you get to hear Klingon. There are things that are different, of course. No hair. Also, their uniforms are different. But one of the things that Brian Fuller said is that he wants to explore the diversity of the Klingon culture in this series. So we may see a lot of different things. This may just be one house that we're seeing, because it's the house of Tukuvma, and we may find a lot of different appearances, just like in humans. The ships are quite different. They don't really look like what we're used to in Star Trek. I guess you could say that the general shape is similar, but it does look a lot different. The bridges look so different. The way they communicate is holographic. They don't seem to have any physical consoles in the ship. So I'm really wondering how that's going to develop as well. And the culture is another thing. This is going to be very interesting to watch. The culture is basically the same. They're a warrior species, so of course, they want to fight, and they are the sworn enemy of the Federation. That, of course, is expected. This takes place around, well, of course, 10 years before the original series, and at that time there is war between Klingons and the Federation. So, maybe this is the beginning of a big war that they have. But over the course of this series, I'm going to be very interested in seeing how their culture is developed, because from what I've heard, they're looking into the culture of the Klingons, and they will be very well developed. That has me excited. Visually, this looks really good. Unfortunately, it does have a little bit of lens flares, but they're not used very often. Also, the cameras are tilted a bit, which I also don't like that much. But the special effects are really good. In fact, it looks cinematic, like you'd see in the movies. It looks a lot like the Star Trek movies. Great effects, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it. This episode takes a look at the possibility of starting war, and of course its effects on the people. Now, Starfleet is not used to going into war at this time. They're mostly exploring, and they've had a few skirmishes with the Klingons over the past, I believe it was 70 years that they said. So, the Federation has been mostly at peace, and they're not used to war, and they don't want it. This episode really surprised me. I was going into it, of course, with an open mind, but in the back of my mind, I was a little bit hesitant because it looks so different from the original series. But I understand. They're going to update it because who would want to watch a new series that looks like the original series with the antiquated looking computers and ships and even the uniforms? Those original series uniforms were kind of, crappy. But now that I've watched the first episode, I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it. So what's my verdict? I'd give this 4 stars out of 5. I enjoyed it. It wasn't excellent, but it looks like it's going to be pretty good. So now, my nitpicks and observations. Now this part does contain spoilers, so if you don't want to hear any of this, then stop the video now. If you want to hear it, keep watching. As I mentioned before, the Klingons were speaking mostly Klingon, which is great to hear. Also, the Klingons look different, somewhat. No hair, the uniforms are different. But other than that, they seem to be fairly consistent with Next Generation and later. So I don't find them to be too totally different. I just miss the hair. In the beginning, when Captain Georgiou and Commander Burnham were on the planet, they referenced General Order 1, which is the non-interference rule that Starfleet has. They can't interfere with other cultures because they're on a very primitive planet that doesn't know anything about space travel. One thing that was inconsistent with other Star Trek series is the phasers. They fire in very short bursts, not beams. And this is a lot more like the Abrams movies. But the communicators and phaser pistols are just like in the original series. I'm glad to see it's that way. They don't look any different. Even the sound effects for the communicator are the same. The overall design of the Shenzhou reminds me a bit of the NX class. It's very similar shape, but the bridge is on the bottom of the ship. That is a bit unusual because other ships in Starfleet have the bridge on top. So I'm very curious about how the Discovery design will be. And then of course we got to the opening sequence of the show. Now, some of the music is similar to the original series. They've got a bit of it in there. But the visuals are very different. It has mostly a white background with different things that are being drawn on the screen, including ships, technology, batleth. Yeah, there's a batleth there, and the communicator and phaser pistol, which of course look like in the original series. The transporter and warp effects are different in this. Transporter effects are different, but then in every single Star Trek series, they are all different anyways. The warp effects are a lot more like in the Abrams movies, where they just suddenly appear and then there's this popping sound. And when they warp out, there's just this sudden disappearance. Now that actually does make a lot more sense. If they're going to be going to light speed or higher than light speed, you're not going to see a streak of a ship behind it like in the Next Generation. So I think this looks more realistic. Some nice things to hear are original sound effects. There are sound effects from the bridge that sound a lot like in the original series. Also, the doors close with a very familiar whoosh sound that you hear in the original series. The one thing that I noticed about the bridge design is that the view screen isn't a screen, it's windows. That's just like in the Abrams movies. So I'm very curious about what they're going to be doing for the USS Discovery. As I mentioned before, we have the introduction of a new species, that is the Kelpians. Lieutenant Saru is a Kelpian. And if you watched my review a little earlier, you know what I'm talking about. When Commander Burnham encountered the Klingon, of course, they got into a very, very short fight. It's not really a fight, really. But did I see pink blood? That kind of makes you think of Star Trek VI. Of course, I don't think I ever saw pink blood in any of the other series. It's usually red. Star Trek The Next Generation introduced the yell that the Klingons do whenever one of their kind are killed. Well, it's back. They did it in Star Trek Discovery. So they're keeping that consistent. And of course, with the death of the Klingon, well, this whole ship that they're in is like a sarcophagus ship. It's coated with all of these coffins of Klingons. This is nothing like we've ever seen before in Star Trek. Now on to the Vulcans. The Vulcan test center that we see in this episode is very much like the one that we saw in the 2009 movie. Now this does make sense because they do kind of take place not so far apart. Of course, it happens a lot earlier in 2009's movie, because that part takes place before Star Trek Discovery. But that is in the Kelvin timeline, not the Prime timeline, which is what Star Trek Discovery is in. And of course, we've got Sarek. He's a younger Sarek. I would assume that Spock had been born by this time because, well, at around this time, he is on the Enterprise with Captain Pike. So, Sarek is in this series. In this episode, we are introduced to the Klingons' cloaking device. But there's a continuity problem here. In the original series, the Klingons got cloaking devices from the Romulans. So what are they doing with a cloaking device here? Is that a mistake? Did they forget? Who knows? In this episode, they mention that they're 6 light years from Gamma Hydra, which has been mentioned several times in Star Trek. I have all the information written down here. It says, they said in this episode, it's an Andorian colony. This is also the first time Andorians are mentioned. Gamma Hydra is mentioned several times. The original series, Star Trek II, and 4 times in The Next Generation. It's on the Federation Klingon border, but also near Romulan space. Now this is fairly consistent in this episode. It is 133.8 light years from Earth. So they're around 140 light years away from Earth at this time. Now going into a bit of history with this one, Burnham mentioned that the Vulcans had an altercation with the Klingons. I'm not sure if this is their first contact or not, but of course the Klingons destroyed the Vulcan ship. This happened 240 years before this episode. That would make it the year 2016, last year. There is a little continuity problem in this episode. In the beginning of the episode, Burnham said Lieutenant Saru. But towards the end of the episode, Captain Georgiou calls him Lieutenant Commander. I wonder if that was a mistake in the script. We see Burnham using the Vulcan nerve pinch on Captain Georgiou. This is not the first time a human has successfully done it, or maybe it is chronologically, but in The Next Generation we saw Picard use one. So that is all. There's a lot to talk about in this episode. If you want to talk about it, then leave some comments in the comment section below. I would love to talk to you about it. Just be warned that there may be spoilers in the comments. If you don't want to talk about that, that's fine. I also watched episode 2 last night. That will be coming later this week. And let me know what you thought of the premiere. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Why? Let me know. If you like this video, then please give it a big thumbs up. And if you want to see some more Star Trek videos, then please subscribe down below. You can check out the next episode over there. There is no previous episode. And you can also check out the playlist down there. Thanks for watching. Live long and prosper.